All right, so this is the second class of the third semester where we are going to start really applying everything that we have learned in semester 1 and 2. So I thought to take some very famous personalities, people that we can all relate to, and one of the main reasons why I love to use famous personality charts is because not only we all know them, so we can, relate to them in some way, but their lives have been documented in terms of when things have happened. It's one of the reasons why I probably bore everyone to death by always using the Kennedy's charts, because I mean, whose life has been more dramatic than the Kennedys? Everything's documented with dates and times. So right now we are going to study the chart of Alex Trebek, who was the game show host, because I actually saw a biography on him. It was so weird. I saw his biography, really, it was the day or the night before he died. I saw his biography, and my husband and I, Daniel, we were sitting there thinking, now, is he still alive? And we looked it up, and yes, he was. He died the very next day. So it was so interesting to me that it all was kind of an omen that, it was just synchronicity. How did we watch this and wonder if he's still alive? The very next day, 6 hours later, we found out that he passed. But let's look at his chart. So here I go. I'm going to share the screen, and we are going to look at his chart. Let me get this out of the way. Now, this is Alex Trebek's chart. Can everyone see the chart up here on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I have him born July 22nd. And remember, I'm going to do this like I'm doing a reading for someone, but talking to you. So the first thing you do, remember this, never forget to do this or you may regret it, is go over the birth data with the individual, because there's nothing worse than finishing a reading and then finding out the birth data is wrong. So nip this in the bud and get the person to confirm. Say, is that correct? So I have Alice Trebek, born July 22nd, 1940, 11:15 a.m. in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada. Is that correct? Get the person to validate it. I had a couple of people come back and go, you know what? I went back and listened to my recording, and you asked me if it was correct. And I said, yes, but it wasn't. I wasn't thinking. That's not your fault. You did what you had to do to validate it. But get them to, validate with you, is that correct? So with this, I'm looking at the fact that his ascendant is in Virgo. Okay. Virgo is his rising sign. What is the first thing I do? I go to the ascendant and I look to see what planet rules the ascendant. For Virgo, Mercury rules Virgo. I call that the chart ruler. The planet that rules the chart is the planet that rules the ascendant. Simple as that. So where does Mercury, the chart ruler, reside? It goes to the 11th house. The 11th house is the house of great gains. Remember, planets in the 11th house bring gains in life. But the ruler of the 11th house is always, to a certain degree, believe it or not, a malefic. I know that sounds odd, and I don't know how many times I have to go over this with students. They seem to think that I said planets in the 11th house are bad. No, planets in the 11th house are very good. Now, sometimes you might have the ruler of the 11th and the 11th. Yes, that's still going to be a difficult planet. Now, I don't know why that ruling is, but I'm telling you, it's a rule. That the ruler of the 11th is always going to be malefic for the chart. But planets in the 11th prosper and grow. They multiply. And the 11th house deals with great gains. It also deals with friends, groups, organizations. And the 11th house, this is something that I discovered, deals with your mother's psychology and death. Why? It is the 8th house from the 4th house. One, here's the 4th. This represents the mother. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So, so it's like these planets are in the mother's 8th house. Can deal with the mother's death, can also deal with her psychology, the deep side of her soul, which is all 8th house. And it's difficult. So the mother had a difficult life by the fact that these planets are in the 8th. And you could say, well, Mercury does well in the 8th house. Yes. The sun, would make you into research analysis. But this Pluto and Mars being debilitated there, Mars being debilitated, but Pluto being next to the sun, very tight, there's some deep, dark stuff the mother had to deal with. It just is. So, so that's what I see with the 11th house. Now, the 11th house is also the eldest sibling. Now, with this, I may tend to think he may be the oldest one in his family because there's so many planets there. And if he's not, then the eldest sibling is pretty complicated. And probably he wouldn't get along with them. Why? Because Mars is the indicator of siblings. If you put Mars in the 3rd, or if you put Mars in the 11th, then in the 3rd house, they're going to have problems with siblings at some point in their life. In the 11th house, they could have some problems with older siblings because Mars is the Karaka for siblings all by itself. Remember when you put a Karaka in a house and a house rules certain individuals, when that Karaka is there, it harms it. So let me repeat that. If you put a Karaka for an individual in the house that it rules, it will harm that individual. Now, it may not harm all the other attributes for that house. So, for example, the sun is the Karaka for father. If you put the sun in the 9th house, it will cause disruption and problems for the father. If you put Mars in the 3rd house, it's going to cause problems for siblings. Now, even the moon, which actually gets Digbala, means directional strength, in the 4th house, you put the moon in the 4th house and there are some problems at some point for the mother. It's just too much energy. That's what I'll have to say. So, and Jupiter, by the way, in the 5th house, you think, oh, that means abundant great kids. No, it's the Karaka for children in the 5th house of children. And many times, not all the time, but many times you'll find people with Jupiter in the 5th house don't have children. And you go, how does that work? It's the Karaka thing, okay? It's the Karaka thing. But I do know that some people have Jupiter in the 5th house and they have children. So it's not always the case, but it is a rule. And for Virgo ascendant, let me just tell you, regardless where Mars is, 9 times out of 10, they have problems with siblings. Why? Because Mars, as the Karaka for siblings, rules the 3rd house, which is siblings, and also rules the 8th house. So Mars, of course, rules Scorpio and Aries. So the fact that for Virgo ascendants, Mars rules the 3rd and the 8th, they have problems with siblings. They just do, or something's over the top, something's extreme about siblings. And with his Mars being debilitated in the 11th house, if he has an older sibling, there's going to be probably jealousy or problems, okay? So I don't know. I didn't research if he was the oldest one or not. That I forgot to look for when I went to Wikipedia.
I don't think he was the oldest, if I recall correctly.
Ask you, since I know you researched him.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Probably. So I don't know if they mentioned anything about the oldest sibling, but I bet he didn't get along that well with them. okay, based on this Mars, okay. So I don't expect anybody to go research his relationship with his older sibling, but yeah, that's what I'm seeing. But going back to the ruler of the 11th house, which is the moon. Remember I said the 11th house ruler, excuse me, has problems. And the ruler of the 11th, being the moon, goes what? To the 6th house. He had a lot of health problems. And here's another thing about the moon. The moon rules fluctuations. It does. No, you will not find that anywhere in the Vedic astrology. I just happen to know that from Western astrology, because the moon moves the fastest, so it's the most changeable. And so the moon being in the 6th house means fluctuations in his health. And if you've seen some of my videos, the 6th house deals with what? Digestion, diet, how you process your foods. And actually, if you look at the body in terms of medical astrology, the 6th house deals with the intestinal area, the area where we digest food. And the moon all by itself is the indicator of the stomach. It is. Remember, it is relative to the 4th house in Cancer. And Cancer rules the breast and the stomach. Okay, and so does the 4th house. So therefore the moon takes on that energy of that part of the body. So when you put the moon in the 6th house, people have problems with their digestion and even the way that they process foods in terms of how they, their body processes their vitamin content. So it's stressed in the 6th house. And I bet any of you that have a moon in the 6th house will agree with me that, there's problems with digestion. So, but the moon not only rules the 11th, which makes it malefic, right? And don't ask me why the ruler of the 11th is malefic, but here's one thing I do know for certain. If a planet rules the 11th house, it will never, ever rule a triconal, which, remember, the planets that are good for a chart are the planets that rule the triconal houses. It's just the mathematical setup. If it rules the 11th, it will never rule a triconal. And many times, as with Taurus as the ascendant, Jupiter rules the 11th, but it also rules the 8th, so it's a first-rate malefic for the chart. And for Gemini ascendant, Mars rules the 6th, but it also rules the 11th. So for Gemini ascendant, Mars is a first-rate malefic. So you will find that the planet that rules the 11th house somehow, and I often said maybe it's because the 11th house deals with our desire, what we really want in life, our passion, our desire. And because so many times, you may get your desire quenched in this lifetime, but it never gives you ultimate happiness, because true happiness comes from our spirituality, because that's our connection to the divine, and that's what's secure and never dies. But the 11th house, all the things that we acquire from this world, eventually we'll have to lose, whether it's our health, our looks, our possessions, our family. You lose all these things. So at some point, the 11th house does deal with suffering. But the ruler of the 11th is problematic. Just remember that. It may not be horribly problematic, but it is not an easy planet for the chart by the fact that it rules it. So not only going to the 6th house, the moon here, let's talk about, it's also the moon is the dispositing planet, not only of the 11th house, but all of these planets. By being in Cancer, they all disposit to the moon. So, so the next thing I'm looking at is the moon is all by itself, but it's also in the Nakshatra Shatabishak. Remember, you look at the nakshatras too. That's why this is great. It's got the abbreviations here, because I actually, when I took my exam back in 1990, whenever I did with ACVA, we had to know the degrees of the nakshatras, and we also had to know what number the nakshatras were. But since then I forgot. So I'm so glad that they have these. I just depend on this. So, and here's another thing, in case you're wondering how to get the abbreviation for the nakshatra in your chart, when you're on the chart itself, when you right click, you'll get this. What do you pick? Advanced display options. And these are all the things I have pulled up that I want, but most of all, show nakshatras. That's how I get it. Okay. All right. But what about this nakshatra? This is a nakshatra that deals with health. It does. It's called the 100 Healers. And many times it's said to deal with hard to cure diseases. That can deal with anything from mental disease, addictions, to physical disease. And, even cancers, because these are hard to cure diseases. And his moon being in the 6th house in Trebeck definitely denotes his health issues, because not only, did he die of pancreatic cancer, but he had, I forgot, Elizabeth, he had so many surgeries. I saw that in the interview. It was astounding that he could have had that many surgeries. Do you remember about how many?
I know it was like I think it was like ACL. He had something else. He had a minor heart. I mean, he just had health issue after health issue.
I know, it's surprising he lived as long as he did. And not to mention, he worked all the way up to the day he died. He had to feel terrible dying, but he was still doing his show. So that's probably what kept him going as long as he did live. Because the minute you kind of wrap it up and you go home to die, you die. That's just the way it works. There's no life force to keep you going. But we've looked at, okay, we're looking at this moon here. And let me remind everyone else, Virgo, in and of itself, just having a Virgo ascendant, people are consumed about health issues. Why? Because Virgo is the 6th sign relative to the 6th house. Virgos are always caring about their health, or even having sensitive health. They just are. That's the 6th sign. Or they're into health or healing. They're doctors or nurses. They're healers, that kind of thing. That's just the attraction for Virgo. And not only that, he does have Rahu in the 1st house, which is, extremes in some way. He also has Neptune in the 1st house next to the ascendant, within a few degrees. Realize that Neptune can deal with disease as well. Not always, but it can. Okay. But going back to this moon, and remember, the moon is so important. And remember, never, ever forget to look at planets from Chandra Lagna. Okay? So if we look at the moon as the ascendant, guess what goes to the 6th house from the moon? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's all those planets, and even debilitated Mars in the moon sign in his 6th house from the moon. Remember, it's like, if you miss out on looking at Chandra Lagna, you're going to miss out on so much importance in the chart. So never, ever forget that. And I have to confess, I forget it sometimes too, because we get so caught up in looking at the chart from the ascendant, and we go, oh yeah, what about the Chandra Lagna? Comes as an afterthought. It should actually we should be processing it all together. But I have to say I'm guilty of that too. But the moon being in Aquarius is ruled by Saturn, right? So where is the dispositor for the moon? The sign dispositor is Saturn, and it goes to the 8th house, and not only that, it's debilitated. So the ruler of the 6th is debilitated in the 8th house. This guy's got some health issues throughout life. You can see this from the onset of his birth even. And all these planets going 6 from the moon. I mean, it's here. So this is, and if I had to say, maybe his health issues originated I could be wrong, but I would have to say from his digestion, because maybe his body wasn't capable of absorbing all the vitamins that his body needed. And over a long period of time, his body weakened without the nourishment it needed because his absorption process or something in the digestion started the issues. And nobody would be able to track that. But that's what I would think looking at this chart from the very beginning. Okay, so now the next thing I would do is, what is the nakshatra ruler? So Shatabishak is ruled by Rahu. Now these are the things you need to memorize in case you don't know. Of course, by this time, third semester, you have to know what planets rule what signs, and but the nakshatra rulers as well. So Shatabishak is ruled by Rahu. So this nakshatra ruler, which is in the 6th house, it brings it to the 1st house. And then even when you look at Rahu, what nakshatra is Rahu in? And Elizabeth pointed this out so eloquently in her article about the nakshatra Hasta. I believe you said this, ruled by the moon, goes to the 6th house. So by nakshatra dispositors, there is a parivartana, just like you could have the sign parivartanas. So Shatabishak's ruled by Rahu. Rahu's in Hasta, which is ruled by the moon. They exchange signs, so you can see that there's this stress that brings it to what? The 1st house is your physical body. So health issues because of this. And he's plagued with health issues all through his life. So you see, even though maybe you may not be into Jeopardy or any of the, the game shows that he hosted or he was in, you know, his health issues are documented. So he's a good example to use just all around to understand his life and his chart. So, so also I always look at Rahu and K2 as our karma and our destiny. So when people have Rahu and K2, and it can be either Rahu in the 7th and K2 in the 1st, or Rahu in the 1st and K2 in the 7th, one of their biggest karmic destinies that they've come here to heal is relationships. It is. Remember that axis is going to be your issue. So I kind of look at K2 as our past life and Rahu as our future life, but really they're one and the same. They play off each other. You're trying to learn through this variable. And remember, opposing houses have extreme similarities. So it's you and relationships that you're here to work out. But because K2 is kind of like our past life, what has been left undone in a past life that you've come here to heal? That's what your K2 is. It's in his 7th house. He left off with difficulty in relationship that he came here to heal. Now, I don't know if he healed it, but but I know he was married. Wasn't he married a number of times? He was like, in the biography I saw of him, they were talking about all the supermodels and movie stars that he dated at one time.
I think he was married twice. I think he married his first wife and then his second wife, who was super young compared to him.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I read that this morning too. But I thought, you know, in the interview I saw of him, he dated all the major movie stars in the 70s, supermodels and movie stars. They were laughing about, you know, all the dates he had. Of course, he wasn't married to them, but he liked beautiful women. And yeah, now and then when he passed, yeah, his wife was very, very young. Also. So like I said, I don't know if he healed his relationship issues. Maybe he did. I'm not one to say this, but that is what he came here to do. And Rahu being in the 1st house, it's like in this lifetime, he came here to be who he was, you know, meant to be. But through relationships, he had to work on healing both he and himself and how he operated in relationships. That's how I see the Rahu K2 in the 1st and 7th house. Okay, so then I jump. What I do when I read a chart is I jump and I process each planet in the house. Because when you do this, you will take in the rulers of all the houses. So next I'm going to go to the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, because we looked at Saturn in terms of its rulership of the 6th house, but it also rules the 5th house, and it's with Jupiter, but it is debilitated. So so there's definitely something going on with children, because Saturn also rules the 5th. But the 5th house ruler, remember, is good for the chart always, regardless if it rules a Dasthana as well. And in his case, it does. Excuse me, the 6th house is a Dasthana and an Upachaya house. So it has the capabilities to overcome obstacles and problems, but it still delivers problems. And Saturn rules it, but it goes to the 8th house, and it's combined with Jupiter, a very tight conjunction here within a degree with Jupiter. So we all know that Jupiter and Saturn are about to conjunct in a week or so. I know it's December 21st. It's going to conjoin. And this happens every 20 years. But they are very powerful together. Even though Saturn's debilitated, being with Jupiter, this uplifts it. Jupiter carries with it to the 8th house, the 4th house, and the 7th house. So here's another rule. And this rule is another rule that doesn't make sense to me, but it works nonetheless. Whenever a benefic rules angles aside from the 1st house, so in other words, 4, 7, or 10, it loses its power to do good in a chart. It just does. It's weakened. And that doesn't mean it's ruined. It just means it's weaker. So in his case, Jupiter rules the 4th and the 7th. Jupiter is weaker. Even though it's in Aries, which is a stronger sign, it is weaker. But being with Saturn, it's actually more powerful, because remember, Saturn and Jupiter together create power. So his Jupiter's kind of tipsy-turvy. It's just kind of, it's good, it's bad, it's good, it's bad. It is in the 8th house. That does weaken a planet. Remember this. The only planet that picks up strength in the 8th house is Mercury. Other planets pretty much lose some of their strength in the 8th house. So that's very interesting, this Jupiter-Saturn in the 8th house. I mean, you wouldn't imagine he lived as long as he did. Around 80 years old with these planets in the 8th house, plus Saturn rules the 6th house of his health, debilitated in the 8th house. So go figure. I'm not going to ever be one that's going to tell you how long you're going to live from your chart, because there's so many variables, and I believe in free will. So don't ever go there with that. Anyway, so the next thing is, what is the sign dispositor of the 8th house? And the dispositor of Jupiter and Saturn is Mars. And Mars goes to the 11th house, picks up strength by being there, but it's debilitated. Interestingly enough, Saturn's debilitated and its dispositor is debilitated. You wouldn't imagine he would be so famous and successful with that, would you? But you got to really look at debilitated planets from a different perspective, because I believe a debilitated planet usually picks up strength, whereas it becomes like an exalted planet, okay? Because then you want to always analyze them in the Navamsha. If you see debilitated planets, where does Saturn go? Look at that. All right, the debilitation goes to its exaltation sign. No wonder this didn't harm him so much. That's what you got to check out. Mars goes to Sagittarius. Sagittarius isn't a bad sign for Mars. It's part of the same planetary camp, okay? In other words, Mars being in Sagittarius, Jupiter's a friend. So these planets in the Navamsha do not lose strength. Here's another thing I want to tell you. If you're unsure about the time and you don't want to use the Navamsha, you can still use the Navamsha sign placements. They will be the same sign the whole day. Therefore, their sign placements are accurate. If the birth time is questionable, they may not be in the proper houses, but you can always look to the signs. Does the planet go from its debilitation to its exaltation, or a strong sign, or in its own sign? I don't know how many athletes have best athletes in the world. You know, who is the basketball player that everyone says? Michael Jordan. Go figure, Michael Jordan has debilitated Mars in Cancer. Best athlete ever, according to my boys and my husband. And most people agree with that. I'm not into sports. I don't know how with 3 sons, but sat through a lot of sporting events. Probably some karma I had to play out here, huh? But here's the thing. His Mars, Michael Jordan I'm talking about, goes to Scorpio in the Navamsha. All of them pretty much. I think Venus, the tennis star, hers is debilitated, goes to Capricorn. Mars goes to Capricorn. So remember, you will see as a person evolves, they turn the debilitation of the planet into their greatest strength. So Saturn became his strength here in his chart. So don't forget to check that out. Just glance over when you see debilitated planets. Do they pick up or lose strength here? And that's all that, if that's the only thing you do with the Navamsha, it's invaluable. Okay. All right. Next. Next, I'm looking at going back to this conjunction. So Mars is also the dispositor of Jupiter, and going to the 11th house. You know, the 11th house is considered many times the 6th house from the 6th house, which can deal with people's ultimate healing. This guy had surgery after surgery, heart attack after heart attack, and he survived them. He did, you know, he eventually something took him out, but still, this is what I'm seeing with the 11th house. It can be our ultimate healing. And remember that when good planets transit through the 11th house and somebody's asking you about their health, it can mean that they can ultimately heal. Very, very important, okay? So the fact that the dispositing planet for Jupiter and Saturn, it is weak by being Mars, but it does go to the 11th house. So, you know, in other words, he has a lot of illness, but he does kind of survive it. So that's one thing you can see here. But I mean, he's got so many health issues, really. He's sick a lot. Okay, next thing. Still, I haven't finished with this. This Jupiter and Saturn being in the 8th house, we looked at their dispositing planet being Mars. What is their Nakshatra dispositor? Bharani. Bharani is ruled by Venus. So Venus really picks up strength just by the fact that it's in an angle. And Venus being in the 10th house, I mean, he has a wonderful reputation. People look to him as Venus, you know, being this great person. Venus actually rules the 9th in the 2nd house. When you have, for Virgo ascendant, Venus is the best planet, in my opinion. And the fact that his best planet, ruler of the 2nd, dealing with money, ruler of the 9th, luck and fortune, goes to the 10th house. He was very fortunate in his career, okay? And the fact that from the 8th house of difficulty, he would rise to having a great career. But, you know, you would think, you know, connecting the 8th to the 10th, I bet there was some point where he had some scandals to work out or something that came out. Is that true, Elizabeth? Do you know anything about maybe affairs or things like that that got publicized about him?
I don't know that they really talked about it as much from what I read, but I mean, a divorce could definitely
Yeah,
be, especially early 80s when he did it, that was still a little more
yeah, yeah.
taboo at that point.
You're right. Okay. Now, yeah, exactly. So, but you know what? Another thing I read about him, his father was born in the Ukraine and moved to Canada. So and in their family, they were bilingual, speaking French and English. So he, very interesting background and family. I was thinking in terms of the ninth house being the father. His father was a chef, came to the United States. So I know from coming from a family of chefs, same thing with my husband. His father was a chef and came from France to the United States. You never see your father if he's a chef. They're always working in the restaurant. So that maybe Uranus being in the ninth house, many changes for the father. Okay. Now, going back to the Jupiter Saturn in the eighth house, if you look at it from the moon, it's in the third house. What have I told everyone about the third house? It's entertainers. It is. And it deals with communications. It deals with everything to do with how you present yourself, speaking, learning. This is a powerful conjunction, third from the moon, okay? So, yeah. Now, let's move on to the next combination, or Venus. Venus being here in the 10th house, as I said, it's his best planet. And it's in the sign of Gemini. Just by being in the sign of Gemini, it's all about information. I mean, if you think about Jeopardy, it's all about information. And I personally don't know how anybody knows all those answers. But it's like the only time I perk up is when it's an answer that deals with astronomy or astrology. It's the only time I ever know any of the answers practically. So, but looking at that, it's all about learning, education, and reading, writing, communications, all of that, just by the fact that Venus being in the sign of Gemini, what it's all about. And so the ruler of the 10th, though, and the dispositing planet of Venus is what? Mercury. And where does Mercury go? To the 11th house. I want you to know that planets in the 11th house, one of the main reasons why they deliver great wealth is because it's a second from the 10th. So it's the money you make from your work. And with a lot of planets there, he's made a lot of money from his work. As a matter of fact, one thing that really stood out in the biography I saw on television was his philanthropy. He gave so much money to the poor and people around the world. I love one thing he said, which was so very cool. He said, you know what? I have all the money in the world I need. I don't need any more money. If I had millions more, it wouldn't change my life in the least. I have the houses, I have everything. So why wouldn't I give money to the poor and people that need it? I think, didn't he give money to like countries to correct the cleft palate in children or something like that?
I think so. Yeah, he was always giving.
I mean, that was an amazing thing to make such a difference in a child's life, because, growing up with that is a terrible stigma. You think you're ugly all the time, but, it's so easily fixed and they're normal. It's like, what a gift. So he did a lot of great things like that, giving to people that needed the help. And I feel like whenever people have a connection from the 12th house to the 11th, either the ruler of the 11th and the 12th or the ruler of the 12th and the 11th, they give to people that need, okay? Because remember, the 12th house is charities and foreign lands and countries. His sun rules the 12th, and it's in the 11th, groups and organizations that give. And with the ruler of the 10th, in the 11th, he made a ton of money from his work, and he worked so hard. I figured when I think about him, I thought, he has to have a great Saturn, because he worked so hard and he worked all the way to the day he died. And then when you look up his chart, you see debilitated Saturn in the 8th house, you go, how is that possible? It's because of this. Don't ever forget, in India, there are no Vedic astrologers, esteemed Vedic astrologers that I know of, that would ever not look at a chart without the Navamsha. So this tells the story. It really, truly does, because even Saturn debilitated, its debilitation goes to, it's a planet that's debilitated. So you have to really look at this from a deeper perspective. And Venus being here, where is Venus from the moon? It goes to the 5th house from the moon. 5th house does deal with showmanship. It does deal with creativity. Venus being in Gemini, he was on game shows. Believe it or not, that really is kind of what the 5th house is about. But when you go to his 5th house, you couldn't see it from the ascendant, because Saturn goes to the 8th house and is debilitated ruler of the 5th. See how important it is to always look at Chandra Lagna, using the moon as the ascendant. It gives another layer and dimension of what that individual's like. And then going here to all these planets, the sun, which is, as I said, it's the ruler of the 12th and the 11th. He gave to charities. He gave to organizations that help people. And I guarantee you, with all these planets here, he had a lot of friends, but he probably had a lot of enemies too, because of the Mars being there. And don't forget, the 12th house can deal with secret enemies, the people that are jealous of you. The ruler of the 12th being the sun in the 11th house. A lot of people probably pretend to be his friend that were really very envious of his success. That's bound to happen when you're successful. You're always going to have a bit of that. Now, with Pluto being next to the sun, the father in some way went through a major transformational change, okay? Because Pluto's transformation, the sun is the father. Let me just say this, I just remembered this in my mind. My husband Daniel, who I told you his father was a chef, left his country of France, came to America to open up a restaurant in Dallas. That's what brought them to Dallas. Very famous restaurant, the Old Warsaw, and it's still open, believe it or not. But here's something that I just remembered. My husband's father, in his chart, Pluto is exactly conjunct his sun. So I'm talking about Daniel's father has Pluto exactly conjunct the sun. That is people that change countries, leave everything behind. That is just like, go to a country where you don't speak the language, start a business, bring your family. That takes guts. That takes, Pluto. Pluto is the ultimate extreme of guts. And this kind of reflects in Alex Trebek's chart, his father, Sun Pluto, okay? Mars being with Pluto is intense as well. But remember, what I have seen for most people that have debilitated planets, it seems like in the second part of life, especially if they pick up strength in the Navamsha, especially if they go into any Parivartana or anything like that, I've seen where their debilitated planets become their strengths. And this is definitely true of Alex Trebek, working up into the day he died. That's Saturn, okay? So I hope you've gotten something out of this. Now let's pull this over. The next thing I'm going to do is study his dashas. So we're going to pull up, I like to pull up the whole dasha sequence for my clients, just because if they've never seen their chart before, it is fascinating for them to understand the whole dasha sequence here. So this is what I do. It's, those of you that might have gotten readings from me, you realize that I let the people see their charts. I do all of my readings on Zoom, and I share the screen and I record it and I send them the whole video so they can go back and look at their dashas. So here is, and I tell people, this is how I explain it. I explain it to everyone, even though they're not students. And so many find this fascinating. I say, first of all, look over here. This is how long the cycle lasts. And some of them are very long, such as Saturn's 19 years. Below that is how old you are during that cycle, during that 16 years, 19-year cycle. And down here, excuse me, are the years that everything happened within. So, but the grand cycle is the big picture of everything. It's much like the country you live in, but the sub-cycle, I don't tell them it's a bhukti because, that word's kind of foreign to them. The sub-cycle, but we call it the bhukti, right? The sub-cycle is the immediate environment of what the person is experiencing. And I also tell them however those planets are placed in the chart will give the results of that time period throughout their life. But I always tell them, now I'm not going to go back over every year of your life, so don't worry in the past. But what I do want you to understand is whenever you change from one cycle to the next, your whole life is going to change because the whole reference point and perspective of life changes. It's like you move to another country and that's your focal point. So sometimes I explain, the one you start out in, you're not going to get the whole 18 years because it's depending on what degree. But I'm going to tell you, when you start out in a cycle, you realize the dashas are based on what nakshatra your moon is in. And depending on what nakshatra your moon is in, the planet that rules that nakshatra starts out your whole life cycle of your life. Remember this from the second semester? So the moon being in Trebeck, Trebeck is ruled by Rahu. So that means he started his whole life out in Rahu's Dasha. Now, depending on the very beginning of that nakshatra where it starts, the moon may not be at the beginning degree. Therefore, you don't get the full 18 years. You get part of it. So this is where it picks up. Now, Rahu being in the first house, this lasted till he was 8.5. And Rahu's always about radical shifts, changes in life, right? So, so during that first 8.5 years, 8 years and 6 months, his life was bound to have radical shifts and changes, okay? So I bet that something happened in his life when he was 8.5. I didn't necessarily go back and look at that in his life, but let me just say, when you're working with an individual and you tell them you had a dasha change in the year, now remember it's the first phase of it that everything changes, but let me say this too. I learned the hard way. I used to think the very second you went into a dasha, your whole life changed at that second. That is not true, okay? Because here's my thoughts on this. You will feel a dasha way before you enter it and somewhat even after you leave it. Why? Because consider this. When the sun rises, by the time the sun hits the horizon, before that you see the light of the sun before it hits the horizon, right? So therefore, before you enter a dasha, you will start to feel the effects of it. It's not like on this day, January 24th, 1949, that's when the dasha, hit. No, you're going to be feeling it ahead of time. And then consider the fact of sunset. Once the sun has left the horizon, you still have light, somewhat some light in the sky. So it's the same thing moving in and out of a dasha. Don't think that, I used to think you could rectify a chart by exactly that date. And come to find out, you simply cannot, because there's this residue of before and after that you will feel it. So I usually say around this time, And it's the beginning phase of the Dasha that really you kind of get your footing into that cycle. So it's going to be under Jupiter, which is somewhere around the very beginning of 1949 through part of 1951, March of 1951. So that's where the effects of the change are really setting in. And Jupiter being in the 8th house, well, there was probably some, some things dealing with 8th house matters. Maybe he had a grandparent die or something like that, but something happened concerning the 8th house. Now, when you also look from the Mahadasha ruling planet to the Bhukti, that's important too. So when he was in Jupiter Saturn 1951 to 1953? Yes. Gosh, I got to put on my glasses. Here we go. Yeah, 1953. Because he was in the Dasha of 2 8th house planets, there was definitely something around major change, endings, and maybe even like loss of a grandparent or something dealing with 8th house matters for certain. Okay. Now, let's say he's in Jupiter Mercury, which is 1953 through 1955. What you would do is Jupiter, the Dasha Lord, becomes like the 1st house, okay? The 1st house. And you count to where the Bhukti is. So Jupiter Mercury, let's count 1, 2, 3, 4. Because the Bhukti goes 4 placements from the Dasha Lord, you're going to find that it will deal with 4th house matters as well as 11th house matters, because Mercury is here. And I bet I could say that when he was in Jupiter and when he was in Saturn, he moved a lot, because when he went into the Bhukti of Mercury, of the Sun, and of Mars, that would depict a move, especially Mars. Because here's another thing I want you to pay attention. This is really important, and you're going to miss this if you don't pay attention. Pay attention to the degrees, because Jupiter is 19 degrees and Mars is 19 degrees. They're exactly Mars goes exactly 4 placements from Jupiter. And the tighter the orb, the tighter the effect. So let's say Jupiter was 0 Aries and Mars was 29 degrees of Cancer. They're really in a 5-9 relationship more than they are a 4-10 relationship. Does that make sense? Remember that. Look at the orb, because the tighter the orb, the more it will happen. I guarantee you something big happened with this home, and possibly a move, when he was in Jupiter Mars because of that. And if you go to 1961 to 62, I guarantee there was a move. Why? Because Mars goes 4 placements from Jupiter. And because Mars is in the 11th house, it might have been, that he moved away from friends and people he really cared about. Maybe his mother was having a difficult time as well, because it is in the 11th house, which is the 8th house from the 4th. All the variables of the 11th house will come into play. All the variables of being 4th from Jupiter will come into play, and the houses that Mars rules, which is the 8th and the 3rd. So there was probably problems with what? A sibling during the time of the Mars Bhukti. Okay, so then I wouldn't go into all of that with a first-time client, but I'm just showing you what I would do if these were the years that were ahead. But what I do with my clients is I just point out the years, and then I point out when they changed into the next cycle, when the whole perspective changed again. So that would have been 1965 to 1968 that he started the Saturn Dasha. Now, Saturn's not going to be that different based on the fact that it's still in the 8th house, and these planets will go Saturn, Mars. He could have moved again. So that would have been somewhere around 1977 to 78. But I would just point out, at around age 24 to 27, 1965 to 1968, there was a shift and a change, because although they're in the same house, they rule different houses. So Saturn rules the 6th and the 5th, where it could have started to bring about something to do with health, okay, during this Saturn Mahadasha, because it does rule the 6th and it's in the 8th, and it's debilitated. But so during the Saturn cycle, he was here to overcome great obstacles. Now, hold on one second. My sheet of paper just flew off my lap. Let me grab it. Okay. Because I have some dates of things that happened in his life, and I wanted to verify this with his dashas. So, so let's see, he was 43. So here's the time that in 1973 is when Trebeck moved to the United States and worked for NBC as a host of a new game show, The Wizard of Oz. So, so this was when he first moved to the US. So let's go 1973. Okay, where was that? So it would have been in Saturn Venus. Okay, so let's see if Saturn Venus being in the 10th house, apparently he moved because of what? A job and money. Venus rules the 2nd house and also rules the 9th house. Venus is his, in the 10th house, is the planet that's going to give him career success. So yes, I would have said in this Saturn-Venus period, success with career, opportunities, just by Venus's placement. Remember, the bhukti is the focal point, always. Now, if you count from Saturn to Venus, 1, 2, 3, this is, remember, the third. Venus is third from the Mahadasha ruling planet, which deals with what? Dealing with communications. His career involved communications. Now, another thing is, Venus is also in the 5th house from the moon. So this was kind of the deal with all of his game shows hosting that all came about. So, and 1984, he began hosting Jeopardy, and he remained the host until his death. Okay, so let's go to 1984. He started a brand new cycle, January of 1984. So you can see how when one cyclic change to the next creates a radical change in your life. So 1984 to 86, he was in Mercury. It was in January. So this is where, you know, the Jeopardy thing happened. Now let's go to Mercury. Mercury becomes the focal point. All the other planets are going to be processed from Mercury as he goes into the subcycles. And if you look at Mercury, when he goes into Jupiter and Saturn, Bhukti, they go to the 10th house, counting from Mercury. So even though they're in the 8th house, in terms of the Mahadasha, it's great for career, the fact that he's in Mercury. Now, Mercury in his chart rules the 11th house of great gains, but it also rules the 10th house of his career. And it goes to the 11th house, 2nd house from the 10th. He started making a lot of money from his career in this Mercury Mahadasha, which is actually a 17-year cycle. So throughout this Mercury cycle, he really had an incredible rise financially and from his work. Okay, so that's how you'll see this. Now, Mercury rules the 1st house too. Mercury is like his powerful planet, but Mercury does go to the 6th house from the moon. So I would assume that during the Mercury Dasha, which was from age 43 to 60, he had some health issues. So just to jump ahead, Trebek had suffered a minor heart attack in December of 2007, December 11th, let's see. So he would have been in K2's Dasha, okay? And I thought that I put, well, you know what? I did that on Eddie Van Halen. We'll look at him when he got married and all that kind of stuff. But K2, so he went into K2 when he was 60 years old. K2 being in the 7th house, I'm sure he had, you know, stuff dealing with relationships because that's where it is. But K2 becomes the Dasha grand cycle, Mahadasha. So therefore, these planets go 2nd, Venus goes to the 4th, and these planets go to the 5th. And of course, Rahu and K2, they're always going to be stressful for relationships because they're always opposite. But the moon goes to the 12th, which can deal with hospitalization and problems with the health, based on the fact that the moon, anytime he goes through a moon cycle, just the fact that the moon is in the 6th house, in this nakshatra, will bring up health issues. If we go back to different time periods, I guarantee that would have had its effects. Okay, so going through, when he had a heart attack, it was December of 2007. So, so actually, it would have been in K2 Saturn. And if we look at K2 and Saturn, no, Saturn rules the 6th house of health and is in the 8th house debilitated. So I could understand why Saturn could deal with some health issues. It is in the 2nd house from K2. So maybe he went through some issues with his health, with the heart attack, financially too. Because why? It's debilitated in the 2nd house from K2. So that's what this tells me. Okay. All right. So, but I wonder what kind of health issues he had in 2003. I'd be interesting to look that up. So then in 2008, he had another huge change. And interesting, I find a lot of people, and I don't know why this is, they die in Venus's Mahadasha. Now, I'm sure there's got to be a particular reason why that is, but I've seen that in many, many of my clients' charts too. But I don't know why that is. Maybe somebody can figure it out, or maybe it's just coincidental. But
Joni, I'm wondering if it's because Venus is the natural ruler of the 2nd and the 7th.
the natural,
Taurus.
yes, yeah.
Taurus and Libra. You know, because I've seen it in some of my clients' charts too. That's just a
Weird. I'm like, why is this? Because it's like, you know, I had a few clients who, you know, Venus was like, they just went into Venus's Mahadasha, and Venus was in the 1st house, in Libra, and sometimes in Pisces, and you think, oh boy, this is going to be a great cycle. And then come to find out that they died, you know, from relatives contacted me and stuff. I was like, what? So thank you for that, because that's the only thing I can surmise, that it's some natural marika, natural ruler from the natural zodiac ruling the 2nd and the 7th. Is that what you said?
yeah, that's what I was guessing. I was thinking about that for a long time.
If you've seen it too, then it's got to be real. So
And
Yeah,
Joni,
they have like
also, and for
exalted
Virgo,
Venus and all that. Yeah, sorry, Gautam, go ahead.
oh no, go ahead, Shreya. I'll go after you.
No, I was saying, you know, people have exalted Venus and such, Joni, like my clients, and, you know, they have like really bad health problems at that time.
yeah, I've seen that too. And what were you saying, Gotham? What's your?
Yeah, he is also a Virgo ascendant, so Venus is the ruler of the 2nd, which is also a marka, and he was running the Bhukti of Jupiter, which is the 7th house ruler.
Yeah, yeah.
So that made sense to me.
Yeah, because, you know, talking about the day he died, he was in Venus Jupiter. But let's look at March of 2019. That's when he announced anyway, so I'm sure he knew about it before, but he announced then that he had been diagnosed with pancreatic stage 4 cancer. He probably had to know that way before then. But 2019 was not a great year for him. So yeah, all in that year, starting in March of 2018, he was in Jupiter's Bhukti. So, so let's look at Venus and count, well, Jupiter being in the 8th house, that tells you something. But it also rules the 7th house. Remember, I've told you this not to scare everyone, but when people do die, usually 75% of the time, they're in a Bhukti or a Mahadasha of the 2nd or the 7th Lord. Look at that. Venus rules the 2nd and Jupiter rules the 7th, as Gotham was pointing out. So, you know, I've seen that so many times, but just to calm your nerves, I've been through the Mahadasha and Bhukti of my 7th and 2nd Lord, and I didn't die. So it's not like you have to die at that time, but it does. But what I have found, at the time of your death, you will probably be in one of those, a ruler of the 2nd or the 7th. But we'll go through those many, many times and we won't die. But just for the record, seen this so many times that this is the case. So Jupiter being there, and it's, you know, Jupiter is with Saturn. It is, even though Saturn can uplift it, but together they kind of, you know, that's a interesting combination. Here's one other thing. Now, I might be stretching this one, you know, to make it fit. So Jupiter wasn't in the Nakshatra of Bharani. And Bharani's whole mythology is about the god Yama, which is the god of death. So maybe I'm stretching it, maybe not, but you know, that's interesting too. Okay, so yeah.
Doesn't Bharani also rule surgery? And in each of those bhuktis or subcycles, he seemed to have health problems where he required surgery?
You know, I haven't ever heard that it rules surgery. Not to say that it doesn't. I just have not heard that. Okay, but I will say the 8th house rules surgery for sure. Okay. Yeah, but I don't know about that. I know that it can deal with doctors and it deals with the whole birthing process because its symbology is the uterus. And for people that have outgrown certain environments where they have to break forward into a new environment, and that is basically the whole symbology of the birthing process and the fact that it is the uterus symbol. And I found a lot of doctors that are actually OBGYN that have planets in Bharani because of that. That's kind of interesting. It deals with birth. But I consider, if you're talking about birth, you have to be talking about death because they're one and the same, being born, and it's a new transformational change. The 8th house, do not forget, it deals with birth and death because it deals with major, major transformations. But remember, the 6th house deals with acute disease, where the 8th house deals with chronic disease. Therefore, when planets transit, particularly Mars, in the 8th house, people will have surgeries. And Mars, let's pull up all the transits. So the next step, what I do with my people is I pull up all their transits. So I go here into the transit Dasha report. Remember, I'm going to show you guys over and over again how to pull this up on your program. Make sure you have the right dates. I have November of 2020 through November of 2022. That's where I want to see. Never ever have this clicked. It's a nightmare. And then edit transit preferences. I only want the slower moving planets, but it would be very interesting to look at Mars. But Mars, you'll see when I do click this, it's going to monopolize the whole sheet. But, you know, for 2 years to have the whole cycle of Mars. If you're going to include Mars, you want to look at it, you know, shorten it to, you know, 6 months if you want to see where Mars transits hit. But I'm going to click this just for this class, but I would never have this clicked normally. So then points of exact degree I have clicked, And I want to know the Vedic degrees, such as Saturn's third aspect, such as Mars' fourth aspect, such as Jupiter's fifth and ninth aspects. So that's why I have that clicked. And if you want to know when the planets change signs, you can click on that. And then these are the planets that they're going to apply to in the birth chart. Do not have the Upagrayas or the extra Saturn planets clicked. Only reason why I have planets aspect to one, cut that off. The only reason why I have the angles clicked here is because I want to know if they aspect the ascendant degree. All the other ones I disregard. I just want to know if it's going to be hitting the ascendant degree. That's important. And I like to know when they're going to go direct or retrograde. So, okay. And then I click view. You can also print it if you want, but it's going to pull up a list of all the transits here. So while I'm looking at the chart, I have the dates that they hit. And remember, Mars went into Aries in September, so it was in his 8th house, and it's backed out into the 7th house, which is a Marika house. So Mars being back and forth in retrograde is very damaging to his health. That's what I'm going to say here. So you're going to see, because I have Mars clicked, there's going to be a lot of Mars transits, but because Mars is retrograde, it's not going to have as many hits as it normally would, because it's moving slower is what I'm trying to say. So looking up here, let me get my glasses on for this. Well, he died November 8th. I should have made that. Well, yeah, I did. I had November. So, so Jupiter was not yet in Capricorn. It was in Sagittarius. So Jupiter was here, and Jupiter would have been in the late degrees, probably aspecting his planets in the 8th house. And you know, that could be his resolve to pass on, to go to the next world, really could, you know. And Saturn is here in his 5th house. So Saturn was aspecting the 7th by its 3rd aspect. Saturn was aspecting all of these planets. And let me just say this, while Mars was in Aries from September through, when did Mars shift back into Pisces? I forgot. It was September to what? Anybody remember?
In October, it shifted from, I think, October 6th. It went back into Pisces.
Okay. So between the September to October time, I mean, he probably got some really bad news and was feeling really bad because Mars was not only here. Don't forget, Mars was aspecting these planets, and so was Saturn. So I found that people that had planets in Cancer, as well as had planets in Libra, were being nailed to the cross. Let me just say that, because especially people that had any planets around 2 to 3 degrees of Cancer or Libra or Aries, because, well, no, really it was Cancer and Libra. Why? Because Saturn was here, and Saturn stationed around 2 degrees, 2 to 3 degrees of Capricorn, stood still for 3 months there, while Mars stationed at 4 degrees, excuse me, 3 to 4 degrees of Aries. So here's the thing. Mars' 4th aspect was aspecting Cancer. Saturn's opposition was aspecting Cancer. And Libra, Mars' opposition was aspecting Libra, but Saturn's 10th aspect was aspecting Libra. I had so many people with issues and problems with planets around 2 to 3 degrees of Libra and Cancer. So, so he does have Mercury really close to that. So his Mercury, which is his chart ruler, was being hit by Saturn and Mars. Saturn's opposition, Mars' 4th aspect. Now, it didn't come together exactly in his Mercury, but let me just say he's feeling it, okay? But going back over here, by December, you know, he's gone by this time, but you know, you can see that this is what I use to look at these transiting planets, and knowing where Mars is, knowing where Saturn is, knowing where Jupiter is, and knowing where Rahu and K2 were. Now, this program will not figure out the aspects of Rahu and K2. You got to figure them out yourself. And so if we look, Rahu is around 25 degrees of Taurus. And we also know that K2 is 25 degrees of Scorpio. So they're in, and the eclipses that have been happening in Taurus Scorpio been affecting his 9th and his 3rd house. So that doesn't sound so detrimental, but Rahu would have been aspecting by its trinal aspect, his natal Rahu, and K2 by its transiting aspect was aspecting, remember the nodes travel backwards, so they're at the higher degrees and moving backwards. It was close to aspecting his Mars, and K2 here was aspecting his natal K2. So K2 Mars, but they weren't exact, but still, you know, they're pretty close. He is feeling the pain of that. But if I had to say what is the worst thing that he was going through in terms of the transits, I'd say it's Mars. Mars is usually a trigger for things. Elizabeth, do you remember where the moon was on that day?
No, no. I can look quickly though.
Yeah, actually, that was my birthday, so so I should know this from knowing my Varshafal chart, but I forgot where the moon was on that day. So that sometimes, you know, the moon is the triggering device of things. So
Joni, when you say that, I forgot which planet was aspecting the 3rd house.
Mhm.
So that is 8th from the 8th.
Okay, yeah, exactly, in the natural zodiac. But you know what I really didn't look at? I forgot to look at Chandra Lagna.
Joni, the moon was transiting Cancer on the day he died.
Okay, interesting, because that activated all of this, okay? Yeah, and don't forget that all of this may be in the 11th house, but this, in the 11th house is the 6 from the 6, so it does deal with, you know, health, healing, things with health, but it is in the 6th house from the moon. That's where, you know, in India, they say, look at the transits from the moon before you even look at them from the ascendant. Now, did I do that? No, I forgot. But I always remember afterwards, let's say, okay, I'm finished with that. Let's go to the transits from the moon. So also looking at, yeah, the 3rd house does deal with, it's the 8th from the 8th, so it does deal with death. Death matters. People tend to forget that, including me. But, you know, looking at where Mars is, it was in the 7th house, but I bet there was like a lot of trigger of problems when it was in the 8th, went to the 7th, Marka house. It was, that's in the 2nd house from the moon. So once again, we're getting this overlay of repetition of Marka houses. So remember, it's the 2nd house from the moon. And Mars was aspecting Venus. It's also aspecting the 1st house, and it's also aspecting the 2nd house. So it's in the 7th, aspecting the 2nd. Do you realize why I did that? Because it is the 2nd house is Mars' 8th aspect from where it was transiting in Pisces. If you count around, the 2nd house is the 8th house from where Mars is transiting, plus the 2nd house does have a lot of death variables with this. And let me see, So, so it's the 8th from the 7th, where Mars was. So the second house. So, you know, you wouldn't normally, let me just step back from this for a second. You wouldn't normally be doing all this for a client because you're not looking for someone's death when you look at someone. But I'm just showing you from someone's chart how this all works. Now, one more thing, I always do check the Mahadasha and the Bhukti from the Navamsha. So he was in Venus, Jupiter. And if you look from the Navamsha, Jupiter also goes to the 8th house, okay? All right, so here's the ascendant, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I glance at that as well. So here's the thing. You have so many backups to double check your assertion about what could be happening in an individual's life. First of all, you're going to just process a chart. What are the potentials in the chart? Who this person is? That's the first analysis that I went through, looking at the entire chart. Houses the planets are in, houses the planets rule, aspects, and also from Chandra Lagna. The next thing you would look at is their dashas, because a lot of things will start coming out and you'll start to realize with some of the planets, the results that they deliver based on their previous dashas and what they went through. Then the next step is always glancing over at the Navamsha chart to see where planets lose. Right? The very last thing I want you to do is look at the transits, because the transits are the triggers, particularly of the Dasha lords. And we can see clearly, probably pretty clearly, that around the time that he would pass, based on his dashas. Then we added in the transits, the triggers. Then we glanced over at the Navamsha in terms of the dashas. And this is how we surmised really the beginning and the end of this individual's life and what their life was all about. So I hope through this detailed analysis, going slowly, you can realize how to analyze the chart. Now we're going to go over a lot more in the next classes, and anything else you guys might be interested in, or anyone else's life that's famous. I'm not going to look at politics anymore. I'm tired of it. It's behind us. So we're going to just focus in on how to read a chart based on charts that we may have, information as to valid events that happened in an individual's chart. So any questions from all of this? I have a few minutes because I don't start.
I just had one question, Joni. You know, I noticed he has a yod, and his moon is part of the yod, and it's also Virgodama. So that strengthens it, right?
Yeah. So yes, and I didn't even realize the moon is Virgotama. That definitely strengthens it. It's like the planet's in its own sign. Yeah. And the yod, just for those of you that don't know what Jack is referring to, is when you have two planets that are in a sextile to each other. A sextile simply means 3 signs from each other. So look, 1, 2, 3. So you have that, but then you have another planet that goes 6, 8 from these 2 planets. So if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Rahu goes 6 placements, but if you count back to the other planet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you'll have a yod, because 6 placements like this from these 2 planets is, in Western astrology, it's called a quincunx, but in Vedic astrology, I call it a shastaka, which means 6, 8, because if you count from the moon all the way around to Rahu, it goes 8. If you count from Rahu to the moon, it goes 6. If you count from Jupiter or Saturn to the moon, it goes 6. But if you count back around to where Jupiter and Saturn are, you go 8. So what does that mean? It means you're going to get the results of the 6th and the 8th house. That's why it is a life-changing aspect in a chart. I use it quite often in world prediction. And Jack just happened to be in my class that I had for the Sedona conference. And of course, those of you that go into the semester on world prediction, we talk a lot about the Shastaka aspect. So don't worry if this is not something you're familiar with. You will be by the time you finish the university. Okay. Anything else somebody wants to add?
Joni, I had a quick question.
Yes.
I don't know if you find this to be true, but let's say a planet goes 8th from itself to its Navamsha. Does that planet lose strength?
So give me the example that you're seeing.
Yeah. So like, let's just say, for example, Mars is in Capricorn in the D1, but it goes into Leo in D9.
Okay. So you're counting it like from its placement here to its placement there, and it goes 6 or 8. Is that what you're saying?
Just 8.
Just 8. I've never done that. You know, that could be a subject for research. Okay. Yeah. So, but that would actually mean all the placements would be relative, not just the 8.
Yeah. Because I know it's called Ashtama, but that's the only time I've heard of it. So I was wondering if you've heard of it before.
You know, Ash simply means 8. So
yeah.
That's for those of you that don't know, these words are just simply the words for numbers. You know, like Navamsha is, Nav means 9. So when you start hearing all these names, it's simply the Sanskrit names for numbers. But so if it goes to 8, it doesn't matter what house it's in or anything. So what would that mean?
It means that the planet loses its strength to do good or something like that. Okay. Like that planet becomes weak.
Okay. I bet it's just, maybe it's just one of the many, many things that could add up for weaknesses or strengths. So, you know, what I say with that is what I've done throughout all of my career is I hear these rules, I apply them. If they work, they stick with me. If they don't work, I toss them.
Yeah,
so,
that makes sense.
Yeah, because there's so many. Here's the thing. It can be so over the top confusing. What I try to do for you guys is I really try to simplify things so you're not in this barrage of 100 different rules and you forget half of them and then you feel like you're overwhelmed when you look at a chart, okay? So you keep working with that and tell us if it works. Well, but I'll bear that in mind when I'm looking at a chart. But there's so many other things that I just processed with what I did that you're going to get really explicit answers about an individual with simplifying things. Don't complicate things so much, everybody, because then you're diluting all the things that do work. You know, with all of this, such as so many people, they start going to the padas and the of the nakshatras, and you know, the nakshatra, whatever planet rules that nakshatra, the sign, whatever planet rules that sign, these are the biggies. These are the ones that I just processed. Now, I'm sure there's other rules that work that are fantastic, especially, you know, taking on then again the Joni whole system. That's like another whole process that you can back up information with, but that's something that you'll learn later. And like I said, let's not complicate it too much. There's too much to remember. Let's try to make it simple. I just want you to know, doing what I do, I have had great success with reading charts for people and telling them things that nobody knew, and I base it on these simple principles. And just realize certain people are going to resonate to you as an astrologer for certain reasons, and we just, you know, go with that. So there's no wrong or right. We're just different. Some people may love to complicate things, and that's their stick. You know, that's what they really get off on. So, you know, they're going to go to that system in that way. So we can't say one's better than the other. We just say, you know, this is what I do, that's what they do, and so be it.
I was actually not, my intention was not to compare, but to give my strong opinion, because I feel, yeah, and I have strong opinions,
Yeah.
and I love to share. The thing is, astrology, Vedic astrology, and even like mantra knowledge, it's not supposed to be complicated.
I agree.
And what works best is when we keep it simple. This is how nature works. Even in nature, simple things and intuition.
Yeah.
So astrology is all about intuition. So when intuition is strong and there's purity of the heart and mind, we hardly need any techniques.
Well, I disagree with you there. Yeah.
Okay.
I think technique, if you really, really get the techniques down, you can do this almost without intuition. But intuition does help guide us in the right direction. Absolutely. But please get technique down, because that's why I'm teaching this. If you didn't want technique, you could be a psychic and not use astrology. But these techniques, you know, I've made it my life path to teach these specific techniques. And and another thing I want to say to you is thank you for appreciating my work and how I read charts. I appreciate that. And
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. With techniques, I should have said the simplified techniques, you know, the basic techniques. Obviously, we cannot do without. We are you know, without basic techniques. But to go into complicated, maybe if there's some sort of researching, then it might come into play.
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
And you know, it's just the kind of person I am, because there's so many brilliant astrologers that go through all the mathematics and understand things on such a profound, deep mathematical level. I can't do that. I'm not that smart. So I try to find a way to simplify what I've learned so that we can make this science available and doable by the common person, because not everybody can do all the mathematical techniques that take it down to the extreme degree. It's very hard. It's very, very hard. Just like, for example, Michiel Boender that creates Parasha's Light. Can you imagine? I can't do what he does with figuring out how to do the software to make everything work. So he's brilliant, but guess what? He doesn't do readings. That's another thing. You've got to be able to connect to people and want to help them. So here's the other thing that I love to teach. Counseling people. How are you going to help somebody from their chart? You can't just sit there and say, okay, this is the day you're going to die and this is this, or go into all this, you know, rigmarole about the padas and the, you know, the eighth from the this and that, and then a bunch of people aren't going to get you. And it's not going to help them. So you got to make this realistic and make this so, first of all, it helps your people. And second of all, that you empower people through their chart. Use it to empower them so that they can improve and make their life better. That's why we're doing this. We can get so caught up in technique. We can get so caught up in, you know, philosophy, the Vedas, all of that. Forget it. How are you going to help that person? This has to always boil down to the bottom line. And that's what I hope I instill in all of you as teachers and astrologers, that we're here to empower and help people through astrology. And you know, all these classes, you got to learn how to counsel. And I teach that because you really got to connect to people on their level. What do you need out of this chart reading? That's the first thing I ask. What do you need? What do you expect? What do you want? How can I help you today? And listen. Don't be sitting there thinking about, you know, anything but hearing them out. Then looking for the houses that relate to their question, to their needs, what it is that they need to get out of it. Address and give the people what they want and what they need. And maybe it's not what you feel like giving them, but it's what they want and what they need. And that's what's so helpful. And then, of course, you can guide them in whatever way you feel like is beneficial. But one thing is, you got to connect to your client. You've got to open. And, you know, just so that you all know, my clients, when I first start talking to them, I don't just start talking astrology. I try to make a connection with them. Oh, you live in Australia. What is the, you know, I've never been there. I want to go. Or I've been there. I love it. Or I, you know, just connect with the person on what they're about. You know, maybe you're born the same year. Maybe there's something that you resonate with and you connect with that person. Find that thing first so the person feels comfortable with you, instead of just starting to blat out, you know, you got a parivartana yoga and all that. That's not going to help them. You can say these things, I do, but then really make it in terms of how it's going to help them, how it's going to help them understand. So all I'm really trying to say is learn to counsel and learn to connect to people. And I'll tell you what, it's so much fun when you really get to connect to people, because it's like, you know, this is a real social event, meeting people around the world, helping them. There's nothing more gratifying and healing for you. And do remember this, every time you work with an individual, and you help them, you're also helping yourself. There's something in that chart for you to gain and grow through as well, through your connection with that individual. When you put this on this spiritual perspective, they'll feel the energy of you healing and helping, and you will get back from them the healing and the helping. This is what it's all about, okay? So that's I don't even know why I told you all that, but I want you guys to really read charts as a counselor too, to listen and to help, okay? So that's what the third semester is going to be about, really putting into practice what you're here to do, okay? So any other questions before we leave here?
Joni, I have a question about Alex Trebek's Navamsha.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that he has both Venus in the same house, in the 10th house in his Navamsha, and Jupiter, let's see.
Yeah.
Can't see it.
Jupiter in the 8th.
Jupiter in the 8th. And I know they're not Virgotama because they're not in the same signs, but they are in the same houses. How is that going down the rabbit hole and thinking about it too much and making it more complex than it needs to be? Or
that's not complex at all.
okay.
The fact that those planets return to the same houses exemplify the fact that Venus being in the 10th hits his persona. Remember, the 10th house is also your reputation. So that's how he appears to the world. People like him. People love him because Venus is in the 10th. And remember, the Navamsha, it's called the fruit of the tree because it's what we develop into, what we evolve into. And that's why, you know, the Navamsha is really pretty much said to start to exhibit its qualities more so in the second part of life, because we're always evolving into that Navamsha chart. So what he started out with his reputation, with the strong career, with Venus in the 10th house, you know, Venus is his best planet. Even in the Navamsha with Aquarius ascendant, it's the Yogacaraka planet. So in the 10th house, this you can really see that his success continues on throughout his life, but his career prospect is powerful with Venus in both the Navamsha and the birth chart in the 10th. And the Jupiter being in the 8th exhibits the 8th house qualities of his life. And even, you know, you could take it to the next level. Jupiter is with Pluto there. And, you know, when he was in the Jupiter Bhukti, he died. It's in the 8th in the birth chart. It's in the 8th in the Navamsha. So that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Thank you for explaining that. That helps a lot. And just to add to what you were saying, I just think it's so important. We are, like, as astrologers, giving a service, and we need to get our ego completely out of the way and really ask, you know, how can we be of service in the most divine, and what do these people really require of us? I think it's a very simple place to come from.
It is, and it's so important. And people forget. They get so wrapped up in, you know, trying to, impress or do the astrology where, like you say, the ego impress. We got to get out of that. How can you help? And that's make it simple.
Right. I know, I have a friend who does angel card tarot readings, and before she does, she has her own way of going about her readings, but before she asks for Archangel Michael to remove any type of ego type quality, and we each have our own belief system, but that's how she does it, to remove her, having this place of, putting herself first and taking that out of the way so she can really be of service.
Yeah. And after you've done so many readings, it's just something that just kicks in automatically. You don't even have to make the conscious effort. It just comes, so.
Yay.
Okay, everybody good with this class? Any other pressing questions? No? All right, well, thank you everyone for joining me today. Remember, the next class, we're gonna skip a week. It's not next Wednesday, but it's the Wednesday after that we'll have the third class of the third semester, okay? So everyone have a great week. Take care of yourself. Remember what I said about this eclipse period. Go within, ask what you're here to learn during this time, and it will be revealed, and it's gonna help change your life for the better, okay? So namaste.
Thank
Thank you, Joni.
everyone.
Namaste.